Good evening. Welcome back to Against Modernism. I'm Daniel, and yes, that is a pseudonym. I'll be using that, you know why. So today I'm going to talk about identity. Before I talk about national identity, or personal identity even, I want to talk about the philosophy of identity, because this is my tool for understanding identity, and it will give you insight into my approach for personal and national identity. And it's not as complicated as it seems. I'm kind of just setting the philosophical groundwork so that you understand, you can logically work through and rationalize from the same point that I start from. You'll be able to see my kind of rational path to what I believe regarding nationalism and regarding personal identity as well. And eventually, later episodes, I'll be talking about these things. You know, I'll take on the question of ethnic nationalism and things like that. This is the core philosophy that decides what I think about those things. Okay, I think it's as I tried to accentuate in the last episode. I tried to explain it. What you believe at your core, and this is one of the core beliefs I have. This philosophy, it impacts everything else, right? So, if you understand this, you'll be able to at least see where I'm coming from a rational perspective when we're looking at actual applications of this philosophy in politics or wherever. Okay, so today, last episode, we talked about the importance of the underlying morality or a set of philosophical principles for any political movement or ideology. Without a clear philosophy, you basically end up with modernism, which we discussed. It makes things easier to do through technology, through medicine, increased material efficiency, things like that. But it will never be able to inform us on what things are worth doing. It can't answer the should or would, just the should questions. It can only answer what, right? Therefore, the entire system, which we see around us now, falls apart. And you end up with what we see today. Nations with no identity except unrestrained materialism. People have lost all sight of personal identity. So whether that means where they came from, whether that means what sex they are. So men, you look around today, there's no understanding of masculinity, or at the very least, a very shallow understanding of masculinity. Same with femininity in a terrible way, right? And this can be applied to so many different concepts. This lack of identity. Think about this. What does it mean to be a Canadian? What does it mean to be an American? Try to describe what it means to be Canadian or to be American without using these words. Multicultural, tolerant, nice, freedom. You probably can't. And you probably can't because I can't. And that's because we have abandoned our identities, or we've lost them somewhere. So think about that. When we talk about what differentiates us from, let's say, Muslim nations, our answer is something along the lines of, well, we don't throw gays off rooftops. Okay? How pathetic that is. The French people of old responded with crusades against the injustice of the Muslim positions. Okay, they had a deep-seated understanding of justice that was based in their philosophy and based in their faith, and this is what they responded to the Muslims. This is what caused them to respond to the Muslims, right? The culture of tolerance that we have today is tolerant of all kinds of immoral behavior. The only thing that it's intolerant of is anything that's critical of tolerance itself, or any group that falls under its protection. So, for example, the Muslim thing is very interesting to look at, and how the culture of tolerance deals with the Muslims. Because at the core, the Muslim ideology is just a religious extremism, and it's very much, it's in line with traditional Christianity in some ways, but the reason there were crusades against it is because it's very out of line in important ways. But whereas it is conservative, in the true sense of the word, it's conservative, right? This is where it conflicts with the culture of tolerance's agenda. But since Muslims and gays both fall under the safeguard of the tolerance culture, you're not allowed to criticize Muslims. Have you noticed that? Even if they toss gays off of tall buildings. And you're definitely not allowed to criticize gays for offending Muslims with their disordered behavior. So, our new identity is modernism. And we don't have political parties that will replace modernism with something meaningful. That is up to us. And that is the main reason that I want to do this podcast, is to show people what they're missing and what they've been tricked to believe into believing. Okay, so let's get back to identity. What does it mean at the metaphysical level? And this brings me back to my second year in university studying metaphysics. We were studying a so-called paradox. This is called the Ship of Theseus. And it's a great exercise to think about the identity of things. It goes something like this. Theseus, he's a Greek hero, ancient hero, returns from his great adventures and parks his ship in the harbor at Athens. Okay, so the ship's just sitting there for years. He retires, whatever. He never sails again. Okay, eventually, a couple of the boards start to rot away. Since this is the ship of a hero, the people band together to make the repairs because it would be a shame to see this boat just rotting in the harbor, right? So they remove some of the rotting boards and they replace them with fresh wood. After some more time, more boards need replacing, then the mast, then the sails. You get the picture, okay? So the parts are replaced over time. The question that is posed to us for the philosophical importance of this is this repaired ship still the ship of Theseus? At what point does it stop being his ship, if any? The ship needs more and more parts replaced until eventually the entire ship has been replaced with fresh materials. Is this ship still the ship that carried out his great adventures? And there's even a twist to consider. Let's say all of the old materials have been replaced. And instead of being thrown in the trash, all of these old boards and these old sails and old masts were actually saved by some creepy guy who had an obsession with Theseus. And he brought them all down to his wharf across the city. He took all these old materials and he perfectly reassembles them into something exactly resembling the original Ship of Theseus. So there now appears to be two vessels claiming the identity of the Ship of Theseus, one with the entirely new construction material and the other with all of the old construction material reassembled. which one is truly his ship? Now, this problem is considered a paradox, and is... I'm not exactly sure. I don't recall what my professor in university meant to kind of indoctrinate us with when he was explaining this. I think this was used to almost undermine the idea that identity doesn't really exist, and you have to come up with all these insane solutions to solve this problem. But the truth is, it's very simple. And this problem is very near to my heart because this was one of the first steps in my conversion process to Catholicism. And I'll explain that a little bit. You see, I think that we can easily be tricked by this question to think that the ship's identity changes as soon as one material piece of the ship changes. So you have the rotting board and you change it with a new board. So how can it be the same ship, right? You've changed a piece of it, so the material composition is no longer the same. Someone more reasonable might say that the ship's identity only really changes when the majority of the parts, so 51%, have been changed. Or that its identity changed only after every single part has been replaced. So these are a few positions you can take. And I think these are all reasonable positions to take if you apply a basic level of rationality to these things, right? But the thing that bothered me about this question was, rather than thinking about what happens to the identity of the ship, which is a machination that's designed and assembled by man for a particular use, let's apply this idea to our own identity. And this is what I did, and this is what caused me to realize something about the way that I thought, which was a huge factor in my conversion. So I approached it the same way a modernist would. I said, okay, if these parts change and this changes our identity, how does that impact us? Because we know through science that our cells are replaced every few years, right? I think it's like 7 years or something, that every cell in our body is replaced. They replace themselves. So if we apply this simple logic from the Ship of Theseus and we think that a change in material parts equates to a change in identity, then we are either constantly shifting identities because our material parts are constantly changing, or at the very least shifting identities every few years or so when the last of our cells has completely replaced itself. So that's the modernist conclusion, that identity can't really exist because as soon as any material change occurs, or perhaps even an experiential change in the minds of some of these postmodern types, their identity is completely changed as well. And this might lead to you might see this reflected in beliefs about transgenderism and stuff, right? Identity is completely, it's just based on the material reality. So you can take hormones and you can become something that you're not. So how did this affect my conversion? Well, I looked at this and I said, this is crazy. This whole thing seems wrong, because I rejected the idea that identity was so fragile that it could be caused by any material change or replacement. You can't just take a board off and say it's not the same ship, right? You need to, for me, my initial thoughts about this were, well, of course it's not the same ship anymore. But then at the same time, you have all these stories that the ship was involved in, and it has kind of a history of its own. It has it's associated with a hero, so it has something more than just a machination, maybe, right? So it seemed wrong to think of it as something that was purely material. And even more so when you apply that to ourselves, because there is definitely a difference between machinations of man and natural natural humans and the individual identities that we all have too, right? So in order to defeat this kind of defeatist way of thinking, because that way of thinking is extremely blackpilling, right? Like, if you don't have an identity, I mean, anything kind of goes. If you're just the material that composes you, anything goes. Morality's out the window. All of these things are out the window. So I had an idea, and it's far from an original idea. My idea was that a thing's identity was actually kind of, and this sounds weird, but it's the identity itself is kind of floating somewhere above the thing. And that we kind of understand this at a primordial level or a natural level. I don't know how you want to put it, but this is kind of how we understand things. We don't see just the material. We see the thing, and then we understand the material. And I'll flesh that out, but that's how that was a huge realization for me. I was like, wow, that's kind of profound, right? We see things and then we recognize their material. Then we recognize, oh, you have blue eyes. Oh, you have brown hair. Oh, you're 6 feet tall. Right? But when I see you. And then I put together the material components. So there had to be something more to this. And we're going to explore this with Aristotle's 4 causes. But anyway, to continue this, even if the ship was cut in half, so the ship was cut in half, an Athenian who is familiar with the legends of Theseus, they would still easily recognize the ship, right? Even though half of it was missing. They would say, oh yeah, that's Theseus' ship. Why is half of it missing? Similarly, I can look at a dog that's missing a leg, and I still know it's a dog. I don't think, oh, this is some new 3-legged mammal that I've never seen before, right? So that goes to further. That's further proof of kind of my natural inclination to understand things as I know what they are already, and then I see the material composition. So ultimately, identity is attached to the thing. It's part of it, for sure, but in a kind of transcendent way. So further into my philosophy studies, when I formally studied it, I would later discover that this is kind of how Aristotle and Aquinas later understand what we call the essence of a given thing. It is something that transcends, but also includes the purely material components of the thing. And more than that, it contains a comprehensive explanation of the thing. This can seem a little bit weird at first because we're not accustomed to thinking about things in this way. But this is very important. Let me roll this back a little bit and pose a very important question to help you understand. That question is this. When we look at things that surround us in reality, so when you look at a chair, when you look at your dog, when you look at a tree, what composes those things? Since we're trained modernists by default in today's society, we're inclined, and I was inclined when I was in school, to answer that we are simply made up of matter, and that's it. We are kind of a lucky, random aggregate of various atoms that have organized themselves against all odds into rational beings who do philosophy and paint and sculpt beautiful images through the process of evolution somehow. Okay? And I'm not debating evolution right now. And this theory, it can have some things to say about evolution, but ultimately, it does work with an evolutionary understanding of the world, but that's another thing to talk about. I'll explain it a little bit more. Aristotle offers a different way of understanding this question about what composes things. And his answer gives a more satisfying explanation to this question about whether the identity or the essence of things is simply reducible to material. And you'll quickly see that that's not the case. So here, without further ado, are Aristotle's 4 causes. And remember, the question we're asking to put all this in perspective is what composes things. Okay? And this all relates to identity or essence. So the first cause, and when I say cause, of course, I mean the component of being, is the material cause or the matter. Simple enough, right? This is the matter that the being is composed of. If we're talking about a rubber bouncy ball, the material cause of the ball would be the rubber. Very simple. The second cause or component is the efficient cause. This is the agent that builds, forms, or produces the material cause. In the case of the bouncy ball, this would be the factory worker that pours the rubber into the mold. And in the case of a house, this would be the carpenter or the plumber or the bricklayer. This would be someone who is physically constructing the thing. The third cause is the formal cause. Think of this as the design of the ball. And in the house, this would be the blueprint of the house. This informs the worker or the efficient cause that the ball is to be made to specific dimensions. So it has to be a certain size. It has to have a certain amount of bounciness, etc. Maybe it has to be red. Finally, the fourth cause is called the final cause. And if these causes seem kind of, you're sitting here and you're like, what? This is completely retarded. Why are you telling me about these causes? This is the stupidest way of looking at things ever. And why are we even asking these questions? Well, here's why. The fourth cause is the final cause. Okay? The entire theory of the 4 causes is completely reliant and tied together by this cause. And that's because the final cause is the purpose that the ball serves. So why is that important? What is the purpose of the ball? The purpose of this ball is to be bouncy and probably to be used by children for playing games, right? So this seems somewhat confusing. And that's because we approach these causes from the material up to the transcendental. And that's how we tend to approach things now, right? We tend to say, well, what is the material cause of his behavior? Why, like, he's acting crazy right now. He must, or let's say she's acting crazy right now. It's probably more accurate. She's acting crazy right now. She must have some chemical imbalances at maybe this time of the month or something like that, right? We have this idea that things have to be explained from the material up. So when we looked at this problem, it seems like we just decided that the ball should be made of rubber, before we even understood the ball's purpose. But the way that Aristotle and Aquinas understand reality is from a top-down perspective. And I think what blew my mind when I was in that class and studying the Ship of Theseus is that I realized, wow, you know what? We understand things from a top-down perspective. At least I do. And that's why I had these strange notions in my head that the problem could not be solved by saying that the identity of the ship changed when we replaced the material. Because I said to myself, something's wrong here. And I think when you when you're reading about the four causes just now as I listed them, you're saying to yourself, this is weird. Why do I care about the material cause? Why do I care that the ball's made of rubber? Well, you care that the ball's made of rubber because you understand innately that the ball's purpose is to bounce. Okay? So the final cause informs all of the other causes. And this works in a hierarchical way. Okay? So the final cause informs the formal cause. The final cause is the purpose. The formal cause says, what is the design? So in order to design it, you need to relate back to the final cause. And the design can include that the fact that the ball has to be able to bounce. And the formal cause, or the design, will inform the builder. And the builder will inform the material. Okay? So that's how things work. And once you realize that we understand things from a top-down perspective when we look at the world, it might have a huge impact, and I hope it does. I hope it has a huge impact on the way that you understand things, because this was huge for me. I really can't accentuate that enough, and I hope that I kind of got the point across to you in a way that blew your mind a little bit, at least, because it blew mine. So anyway, let's get back on track here. So they do understand reality from the top-down perspective. And if we say that the ball has an efficient cause, or the agent, or the builder, that forms it or builds it in a specific way, or a material cause of rubber and not, let's say, lead, this makes no sense unless we first understand the purpose of the ball, right? Obviously, the blueprint maker, the builder, and the person choosing the material must first fully understand what the ball is for in order to correctly fulfill their duties. This all makes sense. So the ball is a good example for illustrating the basics, but again, we face a similar problem that we faced with the ship, because a ball is made by man. Okay? What about something like a heart? A human heart. Try to describe the heart without using the final cause or the purpose. You might say that, well, the heart is made up of muscle fibers. It was created by the cell interactions in your mother's womb, the same ones that made the rest of you. And it was given as design by the DNA you received from your parents. Okay? Well, those all might be true, but does this tell us what a heart really is? The purpose of the heart is obvious. It's to pump blood throughout the body. And the purely material composition of the heart, which is the muscle fibers and the cells, as well as the efficient and formal causes of the heart, which is your parents and the DNA, ultimately make no sense without considering that the heart was designed with the goal-directedness, or the purpose, of pumping blood. And you can apply this four-cause concept to anything. And I encourage you to do so, because it's honestly an incredible way of yes, understanding things, but also understanding that this aligns with the way that you want to think, with the way that your brain actually wants to process information. This perfectly aligns, at least it did with me, okay? So what impact does this have on our understanding of reality and identity? Because it seems like we kind of strayed from identity, but we didn't. If we choose to accept this view of reality, and as I've said multiple times here, I do, because I realize this appeals much more to common sense than the materialist perspective. But not just that. It appeals to some innate, I don't know what to call it, the way that my brain is organized. for understanding and processing information, this is what that appeals to. And that is much deeper than saying, well, this makes sense. It not only makes sense, it fits perfectly. So if we choose to look at reality this way, then identity becomes a lot clearer. Identity ultimately contains, but not just contains, it is guided. And we're talking about that transcendent floating thing above the material. And that's the identity. It contains it, but it's more. And it's the main thing to think about is that goal directedness or purpose of the thing that is built into that transcendent floating I don't know what you'd call it, a ghost. I was thinking when I first reached this when I first read this question and studied this, I was thinking, yeah, it's weird because I can imagine all these boards being changed, but there's kind of like this ghost ship beneath the ship itself, and I thought that was kind of the soul. I didn't know what I was talking about at the time because I was like a normie and completely new to philosophy. But I was like, there's like this ghost ship underneath it that's like informing what it is. But that's kind of true, isn't it? There's kind of this ghost thing that we see under things, and then we apply or we notice the material composition afterwards. And this might all sound insane, and maybe I'm insane, but this is how I see the world. And I thought this was so important to share because this is at the core of my conversion. And maybe I sound like a complete retard because maybe this is like profound for like 12-year-olds. But when I was studying this, I was just mind blown. So I'll leave it there for now. We briefly went over the Ship of Theseus. I didn't really do it justice, but I think I got my point across. We briefly looked at the 4 causes that Aristotle gave us. And the important thing to take away is that identity and our understanding of the world work in a top-down fashion. So there's more than just material, and things have a goal directedness or purpose built in. This has so many repercussions on what we believe, and I encourage you to go think about this and try to apply that 4 causes understanding to things around you. Not necessarily to machinations or things that men have built, although those are good practice tools, but go apply it to interesting things. Go apply it to humans. Go apply it to... Think about that for a second. Think about, well, the material cause of man. What is that? What is the efficient cause of man? What is the formal cause of man? And what is the final cause of man? And when you ask those questions, what is the final cause? What is the purpose of man? Then you're getting to the heart of identity. And then you're getting into the great questions of philosophy. And these questions are what fuel my politics and what fuel my understanding of the world and what fuel my morality and what fuel my religion. And we'll talk about these in a later episode. I just wanted to share with you that kind of philosophical foundation that I have. And I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'll try to release, actually, I said I would release one of these per week, but it looks like I can release quite a bit more than that. I have a lot to say. Whether it's useful or not, that's up to you. So thank you very much for listening. And you'll hear from me again soon.